Good evening. I'm Mariela Colon, and thank you for joining us for tonight's program with Dr. Christopher Robert Reid. Now is a good time to silence your electronic devices and note that this program is being videotaped by CAN TV, the Chicago Access Network. Tonight, we are happy to welcome Dr. Christopher Robert Reid, a great friend to the library, who will discuss his acclaimed book, Black Chicago's First Century, 1833 to 1900. Dr. Reid currently holds the rank of Professor Emeritus of History at Roosevelt University, Chicago, Illinois. He previously was awarded a distinguished chair within the History Department and served as Seymour Logan Professor of History and North American Studies between 1998 and 2001. He received his BA and MA in American History from Roosevelt and completed his doctoral studies in American History at Kent State University in 1982. He is also the author of Knock at the Door of Opportunity, Black Migration to Chicago, 1900 through 1919. In his own words, the most important of his credentials is his connection to the heart and soul of Chicago, its people, and their history. Following the program, the author will be signing books, and they will be available for purchase at the back of this room. We're very pleased he's with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Christopher Robert Reid.
Good evening. I'd like to thank Craig Davis of the Department of Cultural and Civic Engagement, and thanks for that introduction. Quite pleased to be here at the Washington Library Center. I was told that I only had 8 minutes to speak. Now that's what the president at Roosevelt told me at a commencement about 50. Oh, a little closer?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can raise it a bit too, if you like.
Yeah. The president told me, yes, that I had 8 minutes to speak at commencement. Okay. Craig Davis told me I can just go. This is a book, Black Chicago's First Century, the Green Book, that took maybe 30 years to put together. It was originally published in 2005. It's been reprinted in a paper edition for your enjoyment and edification. Originally, I never would have put these books up here, but someone told me it's a good way to introduce yourself to any assemblage. I like to introduce you now to my inspiration. This is my family. The little girl, so attractive, so intelligent, is my mother. This is a photograph taken 100 years ago. Some of you have seen it, and you know how obsessed I get with family. What a great motivator to have people around, at least spiritually, who pushed you forward and upward. You can read, and I just started using PowerPoint about 4, 5, 6 years ago, and I always objected to a speaker reading from a screen when in fact I knew how to read. But this is an interesting story because the older man to your right, to your left, is that to your, to your left, that's my great-grandfather. The 3 attractive women standing are 3 of his daughters. The 2 gentlemen, one seated, one standing, are his sons-in-law, and the young girl I've already introduced. He was in Kentucky, and this is not part of the story, but I like to talk about it, during slavery days. And when the Civil War came, the Emancipation Proclamation did not include within its limits anybody in Kentucky. He got his freedom by joining the Union Army. And as a private in the Union Army, he fought against the Army of Northern Virginia and was there at Appomattox when Robert E. Lee surrendered. As a widower, he had difficulty in caring for himself down in Kentucky after his wife died in 1910, and he came to Chicago around 1917, 1918 to live with his children. So that's the story on the photographs. We're quite proud of Grandpa Slaughter. Now, the Chicago experience starts with DuSable. We're all aware of his resilience, self-reliance, independence, and his ability to make money. He was Chicago's first entrepreneur and businessman in the European tradition. He was born in Haiti. His father was probably French. His mother was of West African descent. He was part of that French tradition that wanted to make money during the age of commerce. And the French, of course, had located outposts up and down the Mississippi: Mobile, New Orleans, St. Louis, Louisville, Peoria, all the way up to Chicago. And he was here in the late 1770s. And when he left in 1800, as a Leo Burnett radio ad said in the 1980s, he left a footprint of financial success that was duplicated through the decades and puts us where we are today in this beautiful building. DuSable was quite a fellow. The city council about 5 years ago declared that March 4th was to be DuSable's day of being honored, and it is the city's birthday. March 4th of every year is supposed to be, by city ordinance, a day you recognize DuSable for his contributions in making Chicago the financial giant that it is. Let's move on. The question before us is why and how this book was written. The why is very interesting. There was a need. I introduced a course at Northern Illinois University in 1973, the first of its kind dealing with the history of African Americans in Chicago. I had never heard anything that was structured, nothing organized about African Americans in Chicago. Had only recently really been aware of DuSable's contribution, had been made aware, 15, 20 years before I started this course, of the fact that there were black banks in Chicago. I was surprised when an older sister mentioned this to me. I couldn't believe her at first. That's part of the history of Chicago that needed to be what? Uncovered. So over a 30-year period, after recognizing the need, I started with conceptualization of how a book should be put together, because every history that a historian puts together is shaped by many influences. The first being a need to be accurate, from number two, documents. Recovery followed, and by 2005, presentation came with this book. Some of the issues I considered with conceptualization was the class structure of the African American population, say back in the 1830s. There is a population that starts to grow in the 1830s. That's 30 years after DuSable left in 1800. And there are enough men and women to talk in terms of family life. And by the 1840s, you're going to have institutions that are essential to the development of any frontier community: the church and the saloon. Yeah, that's right. It was a frontier area. There was a bear shot at LaSalle and Madison in the 1830s. The mosquitoes were as big as your this thumbnail. They're really large. I looked at external forces at work, such as the Illinois Black Code. I looked at communal customs, how people would go about playing, and play was horse racing, races between men, having dogs gobble up rats. That was fun. I wanted to know about the level of resistance because I was concerned about whether or not there was black agency, that is, self-assertiveness. And then, of course, how can you have any story that you're going to try to tell without including women? In this case, I'll mention the Big Four, who were very active in the abolitionist struggle in the 1840s, 1850s. Among men, and we always include in any history men, I was wondering about men whose heads stood highest, who served the community, who served the cause, who took up the mission to advance his people. Now, in talking about restraints, I had to consider, when I conceptualized whether or not these African Americans displayed agency, I had to consider the influence of a set of laws, the Illinois Black Code, that regulated black life. A black person could not testify in court against a white person. A black person could not hold a white person as a servant. That's pretty crazy when you think about it. What if you're wealthy? You could own property and gain wealth, but you couldn't have a white person as a servant in Illinois. When you came into Illinois, you should have posted a bond of $250 to $1,000, and you would have had to have registered at the county seat as a free person of color. You'd have papers. If you didn't have papers, you could be arrested on the street. In fact, any white person in Illinois could stop you and say, "Let me see your papers." I'm going to show you a man in a minute, John Jones, who left his papers in the county seat of Cook County, that's Chicago, and you could probably examine it tomorrow if you wanted to, his certificate of freedom. Now, the population was going to grow, not only by people with certificates arriving, enjoying what freedom there was in America for persons of African descent, but it was going to grow by the addition of people who were freedom seekers. I've been challenged in recent years to stop talking about fugitives and refer to them by a more proper and correct label. They're freedom seekers. They escaped from slavery and they come here. They have no papers, which means they'd better find an environment where they're welcomed and protected, or else. And the biggest fear of those people without papers was to be what? Captured, quote unquote, spirited away, and sent south as a slave. And if you happen to be my size and a reward poster talked about a man 6 feet tall, if you could grab me, I'd fit the bill. Bounty hunters, sheriffs, deputies from the South could all lay claim to my body and sell me south. Being spirited away did occur in Chicago. One of the most tragic cases involved a woman with her children. You tried to stay off the streets at night, and if you did move around, you tried to move around in a group. So the North, and that would include New York, and that would include Philadelphia and Boston and Cleveland, along with Chicago, were places where there was no security as long as slavery existed in this country. So you had to worry about a nation that had a body of laws, starting with the Constitution, that relegated you based on how you lived in your bloodline to an inferior status. And then you had to worry at the state level about something like the Illinois Black Code. Rough going. So that had to have a shape on the lives of people and how they thought, and it did. But what I discovered through documents is that people rose above restrictions, which gave me a great deal of pleasure because it made me think a little deeper about what I had seen in my family's life. I saw a barber, I saw a Pullman porter in that 100-year-old photograph. I saw women who could only be domestics 100 years ago, no matter how far they went in school. And in those days, if you could get out of grammar school and maybe go to high school, that was a big deal for white or black women. But these black women, if they did get out of high school, were reduced to being domestics. One influence that helped build agency was religion. Notice I refer to religion as the core of not only survival but also salvation. I was talking to Craig Davis earlier about this movie Black Panther, and about an hour ago I was reading a theological interpretation of the value of that film, and it related to the spirituality of people of African descent. And when I thought back to my family and these families going back to the 1840s, 50s, 60s, all the way up to the 1890s, I said, you know, one of the things that kept them going was this belief that ultimately they would be free one way or the other. Because freedom comes with what? Your physical passing, as well as getting what? A certificate of freedom, or in the case of Civil War soldiers, you know, your bayonet and your rifle and your discharge papers. I don't want to get in too much into religion because it sort of offends young people. But if you're going to study African Americans, you have to look at the role of religion. And one book I would refer you to is a book by a Mrs. Mary Livermore, which is entitled, I think it's My Story. She lived through the Civil War. She was very active with the abolitionist movement and with the, and I can't even think of what that was called. Someone help me. The Northwest Sanitary District. Are you familiar with that? White women in the North wanted to make sure the soldiers had adequate food, medical supplies, nursing care, etc. So they organized the Sanitary Commission, and they had rallies, they raised money, they had people sew blankets together, and the stuff was delivered to the soldiers on the battlefield. Mary Livermore was a Caucasian who was very active, and along the way she met African Americans coming out of the plantation and farm situation, and she recorded what she saw, and she recorded on many occasions verbatim what she heard from the slaves as they worshiped. And you can see that she realized how strong religion was in their lives. And it psychologically gave them something that allowed them to keep going. They didn't give up. This is something I saw in my family. You never give up. There was a jazz musician in Chicago who lived 50, 60 years ago who always ended programs, when you get to the end of your rope, tie a knot in it. You never give up. This man, Reverend Hall, came from the East to organize the African American population who wanted a church. So they organized Quinn Chapel AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, in 1847. That's the oldest African Methodist Episcopal Church in the city. It still stands. It's at 24th and Wabash. He's the church builder. After he built a congregation of some size in this city, he went along the Fox River, Geneva, St. Charles, Elgin, building churches and giving people a place where they could what? Become strong enough to resist all of the restrictions, constraints under which they lived. Yeah, he's the church builder. Next is Reverend Richard Dbaptise, the leader of a Baptist church, the oldest Baptist church, still standing, but not in its original place. He was active in the abolitionist movement, worked against the black codes, etc. And this gentleman here, as you can read, Father Augustine Totten, trained in Rome, the first acknowledged African American Roman Catholic priest. There was another fellow, but he did not acknowledge himself as being quote unquote black or an African American. He's the first acknowledged Roman Catholic priest of African descent. That should raise a question as we get to the question and answers. What do you mean by acknowledged versus what? Non-acknowledged. It's an interesting story about race relations in America. You have the benefit of having lived under the administration of a person as president whose very background answers part of this acknowledged versus non-acknowledged lineage, mixed racial lineage. He died too soon in the 1890s, and his church, St. Monica's, languished for years. Later it became St. Elizabeth's Church, still functional. What the church did was to encourage stability in the individual and stability collectively through marriage. I've been married 54 years, but who's counting? That's interesting. Somebody might leave and say, the guy was sort of boring, but at least he's got a wife to go home to. He can tell her that he had a great presentation. Now this is interesting, this particular sketch, this is not a photograph, it's a sketch from Harper's Weekly, which was published before and during and after the war. And this is really a, it's either, what's the date here? It's 1866 or 1868, immediately 1866, immediately after the war. I include this because I wanted to make a comment about the number of marriages that did take place before the end of the Civil War. And of course, if you know anything about slavery, the slave masters, for the most part, did not want slaves to marry. And if you know anything about the slave system, the father of all whites and all blacks on the plantation, the patriarch, was who? The plantation owner. He owned everybody. He wouldn't have sold his white children or his wife, but he sure could sell a black man's wife and the black man, and of course the children. They were commodities. There were some slave masters here and there who did encourage marriage. My great-grandfather and great-grandmother were legally married during slavery down in Kentucky, 1863. Very unusual. Those who encouraged marriage many times were moved by Christian principles to protect the sanctity of the family through marriage. And then there was a political, economic reason also. A man with a family is what? Least likely to run away. And you had to worry about what? A person worth $1,000 or $1,500 or $2,000 picking up and what? Becoming a freedom seeker. You know the story. Maybe you saw the movie Beloved, or maybe saw read the book. Toni Morrison, in fact, is out in the hallway. In her book, Beloved, there's a woman who encourages those who used to be enslaved to what? Look at your hands. You remember that from the movie? Look at your feet. You own them now. God gave your hands and your feet to you. Worship in having control over your hands and your feet and your brain. And remember, everybody who was a freedom seeker who left the plantation or the farm was a thief. He stole or she stole the master's property. In fact, one of the leading African American ministers and African nationalists had two parents who were criminals. The mother was a criminal because she taught the children how to read and write. The father was a criminal because he escaped and fled from Virginia into Pennsylvania. He stole his master's property, feet, muscles, arms, brain, tongue, eyes. Anyway, a horrible system. And many white abolitionists use the argument against slavery in those terms. The slave master not only steals the bread that the slave makes, but he denies the sanctity of marriage to these people who were used to marriages in their African homeland. African families, extended families. This was the rule, not helter-skelter lives. Here's a man, Louis Isbell. He was here in the 1840s, 50s, 60s. A white man picked his pocket during the Civil War. He would have told the policeman, that man stole my wallet, but it wouldn't have done any good because he what? He could not testify against a white man. Louis Isbell could run, so he ran competitively in races, and he distinguished himself as an abolitionist and as a recruiter for the 29th Infantry Regiment, the all-black regiment from Illinois that fought during the Civil War. Here's a leading black abolitionist who worked with white abolitionists. And one thing about Chicago, Chicago could lay claim as being a sinkhole of abolitionism, or a stinking in-loving town, inward town. That's what the Southerners said about it. There were enough whites of high moral character to join with blacks who from time to time would chase slave catchers out of the city. Years after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction period, one abolitionist wrote to his white friends in Chicago, Chicago was the only city where I can recall that white mobs helped protect black people in its city's limits. Because in Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, New York, white mobs would have helped slave catchers. In Chicago, they resisted, even physically. John Jones, as you can read, born to a slave mother. His father was German. The oddest of things, when he died, the newspapers referred to the death of Chicago's old German. Interesting, yeah. Very wealthy. Notice, in terms of his way of making a living, he was referred to during the day, and his relatives warned me, you must refer to John Jones as a master tailor. And of course, he was making clothing for the wealthy. He was also an army recruiter. He had a two-story business at Washington and Dearborn. This building was built late in the 1850s. At that building during the war, when people from the East came to Chicago and Illinois recruiting black troops for various state regiments, you could go to his building, as a certain Martin Delaney did, and recruit black men in Illinois from Chicago for the 54th Massachusetts that you saw in the movie Glory. Now, at the point that the state of Illinois decided it could make its quota of troops by using its own black soldiers, the governor said, let's keep outsiders out. We'll do our own recruiting. John Jones, Louis Isbell, and others recruited among the young black men to join the 29th. This is further evidence of developing agency if you're willing to fight for a cause and die for it. John Jones was also active in eliminating the black code, which took place by March 1865, a month before the war ended. And this was a big battle to end this, what I call, abomination. I'll read this. The next big fight after the black code was eliminated was to get full citizenship recognition. That came by 1868 with the 14th Amendment. But then in Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, a black man could not vote. Before Lincoln was killed, and this is one of the reasons he was killed, he talked about extending the voting privilege, the franchise, to former soldiers. And one of the things that John Wilkes Booth said was, this man is freeing Africa to destroy America. First he ends slavery, and then they vote. The franchise is very important, any and everywhere in the world. In Illinois, blacks got the right to vote only in 1870. That's 5 years after the war's end. And it's very tricky. And that was because the National Republican Party needed to what? Guarantee that the party maintained control over the entire nation. And the way to do that was to increased the number of Republican voters. My family voted Republican until the 1960s because that was the party that had armed former slaves and made them into men who could defend themselves and their families. And that was the party that extended the franchise. Now, of course, there was a benefit for the party. 1870, and by the way, the Illinois General Assembly was called to vote in favor of this 15th Amendment, which guaranteed your right to vote against state interference. The federal government can't give you the right to vote. That's a state-level function. But to guarantee that southern states didn't run blacks out of the voting booths, the 15th Amendment was needed. And the Illinois General Assembly had a problem. If we pass this as good Republicans, we'll be embarrassed because our blacks in Illinois can't vote. So right before they ratified, they passed the 15th Amendment, they extended the franchise to all blacks in Illinois. And other states like Wisconsin and Ohio did the same thing. Long live political chicanery. I was concerned as I conceptualized with work. People have to work to take care of themselves. And here you can see I was looking for photographic proof of African American involvement in labor activities. And this particular photograph has an African American. I mean, I really had trouble finding him, but he was in the photograph. I found this photograph at the University of Chicago. A black man is in the let's see, that's your left, something like left center. If you see that, can you see the white horse, the head, left center? Somewhere around, in back of that white horse is a black man with his own team of horses who's out clearing the area that was to become Jackson Park. He was there in the 1890s clearing the land, which was marsh and swamp-like, for the World's Fair. And I like to include that photograph for two reasons. It shows that blacks could join labor activities, and they did work during the period of the World's Fair, because that was a big thing. Can you get work during the World's Fair, or would white men not only get first preference when they came to work, but monopolize all work? That's the key. Now, the craziest thing, the last time the African American population had full employment was during the days of slavery. And in the years that followed, there was exploitation of these newly emancipated and former slaves, but there's a growing number of black unemployed as you get into the 20th century. And after World War I in Chicago, for example, you have a mass of unemployed and underemployed black workers. That's continued for 100 years. You must either own a business to take care of yourself or have a job. It's as simple as that. Earlier, before this period, so I had this documentation, I was quite pleased, and I found other photographs, but before this period, you could get a job tending stables. You could work as a barber, self-employed. I'll show you in a minute a family that had a carriage service. And they're members of the Atkinson family, still in the city. Whatever work you could do, you tried to do to sustain yourself. And of course, there were black men who were waiters in the saloons, hotels, and restaurants. At this point, I see the word recovery as I'm recovering an impressive past. And I think my ego got the best of me. That's why I showed you this photograph of these books again. I never thought too much about it, but if you know anything about university life, you prove yourself, your mettle, M-E-T-T-L-E, by publishing. It's like in sports, it's the Super Bowl ring that you take home that's worth $40,000, $50,000. These books have made me a very wealthy man. I own property up and down the lakefront, in the Loop. A number of people here know me from Roosevelt and remember that I used to bring my lunch all the time. Let's move on, but this is part of recovery, but back to a group I had to include, and that's women. This is John Jones's wife, very important, Mary Richardson Jones. There's a park named after her over in Dearborn Park 1, or Bevan Park 2, south of Roosevelt Road, Mary Richardson Jones, one of the big four, black women abolitionists who aided freedom seekers who courageously fled from Southern bondage. And here's another woman, Emma Atkinson. She was an abolitionist, and she helped promote her husband's carriage service, or what they used to call hack service. Now remember, or you should know now, that by the late 1850s into the 1860s, Chicago was fast becoming a rail center. And people would come into the city and they'd face muddy streets. What you wanted was a hack or a carriage that would take you through muddy streets without getting your boots and your dress muddy. So you needed carriage service. Let's see. Mother Moore. The increase in the Civil War black population brought many Christian adherents into the city, increasing the need for additional church services and a venue to hold them. A new church was added to Quinn Chapel, and this woman was very important in building Bethel AME Church, Mother Moore. Oh, here's a troublemaker. Would somebody read that? I don't want the FBI or any agents to say, I said this. Would somebody read this?
Never be deceived that the rich will permit you to vote away their wealth.
Yeah, Lucy Parsons, a Texan of Hispanic and African descent, probably Caucasian also, who came north, was married to one of the men who was hanged after the Haymarket riot, Parsons, Albert Parsons. She lived on and was active into the 1930s as a bona fide member of the left. She lived on the north side, mainly among the German population because they were very active in pursuit of parity, fairness for workers. Very active, was on the hit list of the establishment, Lucy Parsons, sometimes referred to as Black Lucy, claimed by African Americans and by Hispanics. One of my favorite people, Fanny Williams, born in Brockport, New York, petite, attractive, articulate, intellectual, born before I was married. 1870s. She was in one of two families in Brockport, which is up in upper New York State, before you get to, between Albany and Rochester. I've been there, Brockport. One of two families, black families in town, well-educated. Her family had certificates of freedom far in advance of the Civil War. She came to Chicago about 1887 and was active in establishing, along with her husband, the first bona fide think tank among African Americans. It was called the Prudence Crandall Club. They dealt with such things as Darwin's theory of evolution. So they were critical thinkers. There's an 1888 Chicago Tribune interview with Fanny Williams. And boy, when I found this, I was so happy. A newspaper is a document that a historian would love to get his hands on, especially to have an interview with someone who says in response to this question, are your members churchgoers? And her answer was, yes, some are, but we're free thinkers. We think critically beyond, the confines of traditional religion. And there were about 25 people in this club. From this, I launched a study for the NEH back in 2014 on was there in fact a black intellectual tradition? Well, with this group, you can say it starts here. Then I found more and more information about people who were in Chicago during this period and immediately after, coming into Chicago constantly because it was seen as a place of opportunity. Who comes here and who interacts with this lady and her husband, who was a graduate of the University of Michigan? People like Theodore Greener, first black person to receive a degree from Harvard. People like George Washington Ellis, part of the diplomatic corps from Liberia. He wrote a book on the West African population and was friendly with anthropologists over at the University of Chicago. And there were a number of other people. I think the core of Harvard graduates in the city was about 4 or 5 people in the early 1900s, which is a big deal. And off the subject, by the way, by the 1890s, there were a very small number, but they were there, of blacks coming from around the country to attend classes at the University of Chicago. Early in the 20th century, the Art Institute was open. A few were going to go to Northwestern. And what is now Illinois Institute of Technology was then, early in the 20th century, the Armour Institute. They're going there also, where one man, Charles Pierce, is going to become either the first black to receive a degree in chemical engineering or the first person in the country to receive a degree in chemical engineering. Interesting. Another favorite, Ida B. Wells. She arrived in Chicago in 1893 at the time of the World's Fair. She spent most of her time at the Haitian building, the Haitian Pavilion. That was the first country to build its building, its national building, on the fairgrounds. The Germans were to build one, the Swedes were to build one, the British, the French, the Italians built buildings, and various states built pavilions. She spent time at the Haitian Pavilion because her hero was there, Frederick Douglass, the grand old man of abolitionism and freedom. She liked what she saw in Chicago, met a man by the name of Ferdinand Barnett, who was a widower, returned 2 years later, and they were married. And she stayed until her death in 1930, and he died 6 years later. Their family, let's go back, graces the cover of this book. Let's see. Oh, the book next to Black Chicago's First Century. That's the Barnett family on the cover. My family is on the inside, in the frontispiece. Yeah, quite a family. I had mentioned earlier that Ida B. Wells was such a individual and so courageous that she dared the norm. She said, I can be an activist and have a family. And after being accused of being a traitor to the cause, she went about her merry way raising a family and remaining active until her death in 1930. But that's her family. This lady is one of many women I discovered, and I figured I didn't know much at all about African Americans in early Chicago life. There really was a need for a book like the one I put together, because all of these unsung heroes and heroines were around. This lady was part of a small group of former slaves who was concerned about young women in particular who were coming north to work. And she started a small settlement house. She wasn't the only one. There's a building at 47th and King Drive, the Elam House. Another person with a background like this, former slave. It was abandoned. It's being restored now. It's on the southwest corner of 47th and King Drive. Monstrous mansion. But there were other women. It's more than these two. Here's the man that had the carriage service, Isaac Atkinson. Part Native American, part Western European, part West African. H.O. Wagner, he had Caucasian relatives who he interacted with in Chicago. And I bring that up only because I've had students in years past, before Obama's ascendancy to the presidency, who really didn't think about what they were looking at when they looked at people called black people. They were looking at people who were of West African descent, who had that DNA connection, but also were connected to various groups from Europe and many groups of Native Americans. This is the gentleman who was fortunate enough to meet Ida B. Wells and marry her. Quite distinguished. I looked at his papers over at the University of Chicago, and there it was, his high school, I think it was his certificate. He was quite proud. He attended South Division High School. That was a big deal back in the 1870s. And by the way, let me say this, and this is something I didn't know back in 1973 when I first started this course, Black Chicago. By the 1850s, right before the Civil War, there was a small number of blacks, in the hundreds here, but black children could attend public schools, the few public schools there were, in Chicago. You couldn't do it in New York, you couldn't do it in Boston, but in Chicago you could. By the 1860s, as a black youngster who's graduating with high marks, and because she's declared to be a Negro or a colored person, someone on the school board says she can't graduate with her class, which indicates she was in school earlier, active, brainy, unfortunately, denied the right to march with her class. She did graduate, that's the point. And he was here in the 1870s, late 1860s, 1870s, going to school. I found out that there were several members of the 29th Infantry Regiment from Illinois, just a few, who had gone to school also. I was looking through a document out in Washington in the National Archives, and there it was. What was your occupation when you joined the Army? Student. Boy, discovery and recovery is great. Boy, it's tremendous. I found someone's marriage certificate. A soldier had been married before the war at Old St. Mary's Church, a black soldier, and there was a copy of the certificate. Wow. Quite a bit of involvement in the city. Now this man is quite credentialed, high school graduate, received a law degree, passed the Illinois bar, helped contribute to starting the first black newspaper in the city, The Conservator, and he was part of the first black think tank, the Prudence Crandall Club. Luckily, he met and remarried as a widower, Ida B. Wells, and I looked at this couple, and I thought about this couple and Fanny Burial Williams and her husband, S. Lang Williams, and I said, you know something? They formed one of the city's first black power couples. Well, they worked together. That's something. Long live marriage, long live power couples. Oh, here's another one of my favorites. Nobody seems to know about him. Nobody remembers Ed Wright, the Iron Master. Came to Chicago about 1886, 87 from New York. He had graduated from the city college in New York at 16. Involved himself in politics once he got here, and by the 1890s, he was a typical African American when it came to demonstrating agency. He worked his way up on the county board. And by the way, I should have said, John Jones was on the county board in 1872, first black to get elected. It's in the book. Wright was able to exert power. He wasn't timid politically, over 6 feet tall, muscular, sort of like me. pushed his way around. And he was the Iron Master because he got things done. Nothing timid about him. Probably influenced by New York birth and experience, by his physiognomy, you know, and brains. If he made a pledge, he kept it, and he didn't back down. Nothing cowardly about him. The Iron Master. By 1926, before a Senate Select Committee investigating wrongdoing during the last gubernatorial election in Illinois, Ed Wright responded to a question, "Mr. Wright, who tells your people what to do over on the South Side? Who's behind your group? Who leads your group?" And the Iron Master responded, "I am the group." That's documented in federal documents. The Iron Master was a ward committeeman over the 2nd Ward, controlled also the 3rd Ward. There were 2 black aldermen by the 1920s. He helped get the first black state senator elected, and he paved the way for the first black congressman in 1928 to get elected, Oscar DePriest. They fought a little bit. They united a little bit. Wright wasn't around when DePriest was elected because Wright had dared challenge Big Bill Thompson. He allied himself. He was a Republican with another faction. He knew this could be dangerous if his faction lost, and he told his workers, his patronage workers, "You can stay with me if you want to, but if I go down, you'll go down with me, and I'll understand if you want to protect your family by keeping your job." And his faction, a pretty strong Republican faction, but not strong enough to beat the combination that Thompson belonged to, his faction went down. And Wright kept his big state position, but he was stripped of his patronage. And by 1930, the same year, Ida B. Wells succumbed to illness. He died up at Mayo Clinic. Rarely mentioned, the Iron Master, but he is mentioned in the famous political tract by Harold F. Gosnell from 1935, Negro Politicians, published over at the University of Chicago. Oh, here's another favorite. The tenor from the Hampton Institute Quartet, Robert S. Abbott, a millionaire by the 1920s, a Gullah man. He, like Ida B. Wells, was impressed with Chicago. And he returned and he tried to be a lawyer. He was told, "You'll never impress a judge or a jury, you're too dark." And he tried his hand at printing, and then he tried his hand at what? Publishing a newspaper. He published the Chicago Defender. The Chicago Defender became the voice of not only African Americans in Chicago and Illinois, but throughout the country. He was quite influential in influencing the Great Migration of 1915 through 1918, when 50,000 people came to Chicago, of the 500,000 who left the South to find work in the North. Robert Abbott died in 1940. Started 2 magazines, one called Abbott's Monthly, which predated John H. Johnson's Ebony. You can go online and find Robert Abbott's Monthly, and you can see references to his other magazine, Reflects Us, R-E-F-L-E-X, us. It reflects us. Quite dynamic. In my NEH research looking for intellectuals, I found, in addition to intellectuals, you had, of course, a great many artists like Archibald Motley and others, but you had patrons of the art like Robert Abbott. The banker, Jesse Bingham, was a patron of the art, got portraits painted, started building banks. He belonged to the Civic Opera group, contributed money to the Baha'i Temple. He was a Baha'i at the time he died. Supported the Chicago Symphony and was part of the Art Institute's group. Quite a man. Patron of the art, Robert Abbott. Well, what better example of displaying agency than what? Being willing to fight for a cause. Raising an army. Now, I think I have this wrong. It's not a mythical place called Wakanda. It's called what? Wakanda. I'm going to ask this question. Who would win a battle, those warriors from Wakanda or the 200,000 black men in about 100 regiments in the United States colored troops? Anyway, there were 178,000, in fact, black men who fought for the North in the Civil War. 26,000 additional men fought for the U.S. Navy. And the 29th from Illinois, and somebody will go and say, hey, you sure you didn't get this confused with the 29th from Connecticut? There was a 29th Connecticut made up of black men in the U.S. Army. But everybody else that fought for the North was in the United States colored troops contingent. So there are two 29ths. The 29th from Illinois, as I mentioned, was there when Lee surrendered. They had gone to Virginia in 1864, left Chicago 600 strong, picked up about 1,000 more men who fought under the flag of Illinois, and lay siege to Petersburg, Virginia, for a year, and then broke through the lands around Petersburg, went through Richmond, and over a 96-hour period, over a 72-hour period, 3 days, they marched 96 miles, a hard march to catch Robert E. Lee at Appomattox. I usually make up a little story because I like to encourage young people, but you've seen my great-grandfather. You should be impressed with him. And anybody who's really tough would realize they're not as tough as what? That man. And had Robert E. Lee come face to face with my great-grandfather, I'm pretty sure he would have said, my sorry, my bad. I think that's the case. This is the grandfather, of Ernest Griffin, the funeral home director over on King Drive. That's actually that's based on an actual photograph of Charles Griffin, who was with the 29th Illinois. And as you can see, a book was published. 2 books, in fact, on the 29th Illinois. Here we see black soldiers of the 54th in the movie charging at Fort Wagner. And here we see the battle formations at Appomattox. What circle is the middle of the battle formation, 20 to 30,000 unit troops, as described by Bruce Catton. It was a matter of black and blue and white and blue, a whole string of Union soldiers confronting Robert E. Lee and his Confederates. And in the middle of the battle formation is the 116th United States colored troops, 29th at Illinois, and the 31st from New York. Yeah, New York recruits. And of course, the war ended shortly after the defeat of the Army of Northern Virginia. This young man here, from the west side of Chicago, fought in the Cuban-Spanish-American War. Ade Jackson. Does the name sound interestingly odd? Ade. Have you ever heard anybody with a name with Ade in it? Like a singer, young singer? Yeah, her name is Ala Shade. And I'm thinking, as I look at him and his features, this fellow is of unmixed African descent, Corporal Jackson. Interesting. The 8th Illinois Regiment of the 8th Infantry Regiment of the Illinois National Guard was down in Cuba, administering as a governmental body for several months. And this is an interesting story I spent a little time on in the book. Blacks wanted a militia unit like every other ethnic group or racial group in the city. Everybody wanted men to protect their neighborhoods, communities, if there was trouble or if there was another fire. And so by 1894, black political power exercised itself, and the governor said, okay, there will be a regiment, the 8th Infantry Regiment, made up of black troops from throughout the state, led only by black officers. This is the only National Guard unit in the country, the only black National Guard unit that was led by an all-black officer corps. And these men went to France in 1918 under command of that all-black officer corps. Anybody see the movie on television recently about the 370th?
You were in it.
Please, nephew. Thank you. I received a phone call from Texas about that, and a fellow knocked on my door a couple hours later saying, I saw you, I didn't know you were who you were. That was fun putting that together, the story of the 370th Regiment, out of Chicago primarily, but there were people from downstate. They fought under the French flag because the American government said, we don't want our black soldiers fighting under the American flag. So the men of the 370th had to give up their American uniforms, their American weapons, their rations, and they got French uniforms, French helmets. They had to learn how to use French rifles. They got ammunition from the French. They had the 2-day ration kit that the French gave their soldiers instead of 3 days that American soldiers got in the American Expeditionary Force. And they fought valiantly nonetheless. Now there's a cave in a small town in France, and I met the mayor of this town about 3 months ago at DuSable Museum of African American History. And she said, you know, on a cave outside of our small town, someone carved in the wall 370, and we're in the States to pay tribute to the men of the 370th who fought for our freedom against the Germans during World War I. Now remember the group from New York, the 369th, the Hellfighters were really well known, but everything in New York seems to be written up much more extensively. Those are the Hellfighters, there's a big book on them. The 370th were the Black Devils, and even the Germans paid homage to them, really tough fighters, and they came back loaded with medals that the French government bestowed on them. Interesting group. I mentioned having a militia unit could help in times of disaster, or if there was rioting or anything. Young, I don't want you to get up, but I want to pass out. No, I don't want you to work too much. Here are two African-American women who, during the time of the Great Fire, 1871, were active in helping fellow Chicagoans. The older lady is one of the angels of the fire, Mrs. Anna Hudlin. Then there's her daughter. They had a home. They bought the first home that blacks owned in Chicago in the 1850s. And their home was not destroyed by the fire, so they took in black and white families in their small 5-room cottage down by the Federal District. And I want to conclude, my recovery of this information is in the book. Conceptualization sort of came upon itself because I didn't quite know where I was going when I did engage in data collection. I have to mention that back with labor, in 1872, the first black fire engine company was established. 1872, made up mainly of soldiers. 1872, the same year that the first blacks joined the Chicago Police Department. Then there was a school teacher of record by the 1870s, a black probation officer for women shortly thereafter. There were blacks who had municipal jobs, either Democratic or Republican administrations hired them. And there were plenty of blacks who were laborers, a lot of waiters. And the interesting thing about the waiters was there was a time by the 1890s when black waiters organized and joined with German waiters to strike large restaurants and hotels because the wait service profession wasn't paying enough. Quite an interesting story. Blacks in organized labor, even though it was in the service field and not the industrial field. By the way, I'll end on that note. Blacks were excluded basically from the industrial sector. There were a few at the stockyards before 1900, and one man who would hire blacks was Philip Armour. But it was very difficult to get to the stockyards. And if you read the book by, yeah, would you call it out?
Sinclair Drake.
No.
No?
The other one,
Jungle?
The Jungle, Upton.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm Sinclair Upton, I'm sorry. Sorry, sir.
Yeah. You'll notice that the immigrant groups were the preferred group to hire, and then they were played against each other. The white Anglo-Saxon Protestants played against them, and then during World War I, you have an influx of black workers into industry where you make more money. At this point, let me conclude by showing you real warriors, not from Wakanda, but from what is now Benin. These are the Fon people, F-O-N. They were at the World's Fair in 1893. Very impressive looking. They had fought the French. They had just been defeated the year before. And their leader was put in exile. They came over to be oddities, human oddities. But then I saw from this photograph from the Chicago History Museum that people seem to be looking at them in awe. A-W-E, awe. Oh, who are these fellows that walk so proudly? And you know one of their descendants from movies, from Blood Diamonds, from Amistad. Yeah, he's a Fon. Yeah, proudly, yeah, they're now in the nation of Benin. It used to be Dahomey. Yeah, so I'm ending on that. Let's take some questions. Okay, Young, then this gentleman.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Reid. I have two quick questions.
Mm-hmm.
One, when you were talking about black women
Yeah.
that made a difference, I didn't hear you mention Annie Malone.
Comes along later.
She
Cut off his
nights.
nights. Yeah, I cut off. I happen to mention a few things in the 20th century, but she's identified with the Poro College movement. Very important in helping women, black women, become what? Independent contractors. They sold and products and did hair.
Yeah.
That was the road towards getting out of what? Domestic work.
Okay.
But Annie Malone comes later, as does Anthony Overton, the black man who had a cosmetics firm, as does the outsider, Madam C.J. Walker. All three of those operations were in Chicago in the 20th century.
All right, the second question is, in your book, you talk about Chicago
Right.
and African Americans in Chicago pretty much getting along with city business. Then you get the influx of during the Great Migration. How did that affect those African Americans that had settled here and established themselves?
Oh, how the two groups got.
Yes.
Yeah, one of the questions, when I went back to the first question was, did you have class problems?
Yeah.
Yeah. What I maintain in a book I wrote, what's that? Let's see. It was a book, the book with the Barnett family on it. I take up that question. See the book next to the green one?
Right.
Knock at the door of opportunity.
Right.
The question is, could people who had already been here for quite a while, get along with the newcomers.
Right.
Now, you know it's common for those that have been here, if you're Polish, to look at somebody just coming over from Poland, you look upon them as a greenhorn. The Irish, somebody just comes over, greenhorn. The Italians, the Jews, every group, the Chinese, every group looks upon the newcomer as a greenhorn, as too rural, too country, too backward to really be an urbanite like the person who's been here for 1 week. So the question is, you have to put this in context. We're African Americans subject to the same experience-related hostility. My answer is not to the extent that historians have said, because you can look at my family as a migration family. My great-grandfather came here to be with kin, K-I-N, right? It's kin folks. My mother and her twin brother came to be with kin folks because their father, they lived in Hillsborough, Ohio. He had been drafted, and he couldn't take care of his family. So the twins were sent here to live with their aunts who didn't have children. Once again, the reuniting of kin. And I said, you know something? There's nothing unique about these slaughters. A lot of women and children were coming to be with the husband who had come ahead of them. A lot of women that came up ahead of sisters and brothers and said, look, what's in this envelope I'm sending you, a nice little letter and a $20 bill. Come up to Chicago, there's plenty of work. So thinking about the reuniting of the family in Chicago, I started to think, I think that mitigated against the high level of tension that you might have read about from historians. I mean, it sounded very clever the way it was put, that you had the old settlers versus the newcomers. And I can see some tensions, and I know the Defender wrote about how you should dress and conduct yourself in a big city, but you got kin working it out. Your cousin's here and goes to Olivet Baptist Church. You come here, live with your cousin or near your cousin, go to where your cousin works and gets a job. And that was being worked out through the thousands that arrived, the 50,000. And I talk about meshing, M-E-S-H-I-N-G, the meshing of the groups, with some tensions, but not to the extent that historians have proposed. It just doesn't make sense. I know of too many people. Anybody here have any experience with relatives coming up and joining with family members that were here earlier? Nobody? There's a hand back there. Would you hold your hand up? See? Okay, see? There's somebody that can attest to that. The next question. Thank you. Yeah? Yeah.
Thank you for a fabulous learned dissertation this evening. I have one specific question for the topic at hand. So you said up to 18 or 1900.
Not any,
What was the Daniel Burnham perspective on the active blacks and even the black belt at that time, as he did his great Chicago plan as part one? And secondly, considering how this was fascinating to me as a student of history and a teacher for over 50 years, how do you get this fabulous stuff to the students who still in school seem to think that history is boring unless there's people like you that can bring it alive like this evening has shown us?
Thank you. All right. Thanks for the compliment. But the first answer, get you in a minute, is I don't think Daniel Burnham would have been concerned about the 30,000 blacks in town. Most, well, they were either scattered, because blacks did live next to whites, and a lot of blacks lived in what we call the Black South Side, Bryant'sville. But they usually lived, 12th Street maybe down to 18th, then 22nd, later down to 31st. They were virtually invisible because they weren't an industry until the Great Migration. They were domestics, and nobody who was hiring somebody as domestic sees them as a human being for the most part. And then the effective domestic does make himself or herself invisible. You're not supposed to engage with your employers. So the Burnham plan was for the Chicago that he dreamed could come into fruition, the one you see now with the Roosevelt Road Bridge from Canal to State, and the extension all the way to Columbus. This is what he envisioned. Anybody remember when the Central Station was down at 12th in Michigan? Yeah, it was a different situation. And he dreamed right over here with the Congress Circle. That was part of his plan. He dreamed of that. And Northernly Island, that was something that he thought. So, but it would not have included thinking at all about African Americans, an afterthought. Unfortunately, what we're saying is, it's like today. If you advertise Chicago as a tourist destination, more likely than not, you're going to exclude, as the French said, anything south of 35th Street.
Right.
Yeah, so, and in this country, African Americans basically are an afterthought. And the second question, that's the difficult one, how do you work and make history interesting? You have to work really hard. I have a couple of people who are my students at Roosevelt here. Sometimes you have to act silly to engage people. You have to have stories. The personal put down is very helpful. Telling people, I don't know, I'll look up that. That's good. But that's something that my group, the Black Chicago History Forum, is working on. And by the way, I'd like for you to look us up under this website address, Black Chicago History, one word, .org, O-R-G, not com. You can find us now, blackchicagohistory.org. We're trying to bridge the gap between the generations because it's very difficult to interest young people who don't even remember, well, don't mention Vietnam, that means nothing. Don't mention Harold Washington. Probably a lot of young people have never heard of a daily. So it's difficult. I have a few ideas, and I do agree with people who are in education who say you have to engage students in doing something that relates to their experience. They have to be engaged in something that relates to their experience, something they're interested in, and that's a toughie. Patrick McCoy.
I wanted to ask a question. How many blacks were in the city in 1870, 71? And where did they live, and were they dramatically affected by the fire?
Yeah, let's see, it was 1,000 when 1860 came, and 1/3 left the city, afraid that the South might win the war. Okay, and then by 1870, the population went up to maybe 3,000 or something, I believe. There weren't a lot of blacks. Now, where did they live? In this area. Everybody in the city lived around here, the central city. I mean, you did not have, at the time of the fire, you had some folks over west, very impoverished people, mainly immigrants. You had some people north of the river, but most of the people lived in this area here, and you'd have blacks living a door or so from somebody white. And when the second big fire took place in 1874, and by the way, blacks did have their homes destroyed right around here during the fire. In the second fire, 1874, which some blacks have renamed the Great Black Fire, but it affected a lot of people. What was remaining of the black community was virtually wiped out, and then blacks moved farther south past 12th Street, heading down, towards 31st, 39th, in years that followed. The population by 1900 was about 30,000, I think. People were constantly coming in. And remember now, blacks, when you looked at the census tracts, you look at examine demographics, you don't have a pattern of residential segregation. And you establish that by the number of blacks in a certain census tract, so many blacks in the census tract. So you have no quote-unquote ghetto. I discussed that. That's nonsense. You have black communities, some that are nice, some that are blighted, some is mixed, blighted, and nice. But blacks lived around whites, especially living west. The west side population was mixed in. Now, I'm a graduate of John Marshall High School. I went to school over West, always with people from the various nationalities. I still remember the youngsters. Every group you can think of was in my grammar school or high school. Every group, Irish, German, Polish, every religious group, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, just a whole lot of people living west. So it wasn't like the South Side, where slowly a solid community, a democratic base was being established, especially by the time of the Great Migration, 1915, because you have a lot of people flowing in, and people take notice of 50,000 people coming in 3-4 years, and you can't miss their skin color. And one thing about America was what? Very color conscious, always. So by 1920, you have a solid black community, which is going to be called Black Belt or the South Side. And the real estate people, of course, today call it Bronzeville. But I was born over there. It was always just the South Side. That's it. 1920. How you doing? Right.
You had an illustration from Harper's Weekly.
Right.
How accurate are those illustrations?
I would say there's a bias always. It's difficult for people who have been taught that another group was made up of others, and the others are either subhuman or tilting towards a touch of humanity in their thinking and living. So you will see exaggerated features, but Harper's does give, it's a good indicator of black life from time to time. The marriage, people that are contrabands escaping from fighting during the Civil War, somewhat accurate. Look, even today in 2018, well, I know you remember when Vanessa Williams was Miss America. Her nose was thickened on, I think it was Good Housekeeping magazine. O.J. Simpson was darkened on Time. Yeah, you do have a tendency, because of the bias, that's very American, to make the others distinguishable as the others. A student once asked me in 1974, do black people eat with knives and forks? And I was perplexed. I had to think, what do we do in my house? Now, by the way, I had a white professor once who used to eat soup in such a manner, you would think that maybe he wasn't going to use his spoon. I mean, if you know, and if you were older and knew who this man was, I mean, he was just ferocious when he ate. He had no table manner. But yeah, we eat soup with spoons, and we use knives and forks. And I've seen youngsters have difficulty eating chicken with knives and forks, which takes me to a story. In 1958, December, I was a high school senior, and every week, seniors, only males, unfortunately, were invited to go to lunch with big-time executives at the Executive Club. And there was a hotel called the Sherman down here across from City Hall, where the State of Illinois building sits. And so I was selected, and I went down. I was sitting at a table with a banker, a white banker, pinstripe suit, older man, very gentlemanly. And he remarked, we had this chicken. If I were at home, I'd be eating this with my fingers. We were eating with knives and forks. Yeah, interesting question. Yeah, there is a bias even today. You can look at the choice of people used to represent the black community after a fire or violence or whatever. The editors cherry pick from the newsreels on who they're going to put in on the camera for 15 seconds. And the tendency is to choose somebody who conforms to the stereotype. Yes, yeah. The bad people? Vice, right? V-I-C-E?
VICE, who maybe home liquor, home brew,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
grams, stuff, I mean,
Well, you're embarrassing me because my family made dandelion wine at one time. I mean, that was common. And this is before, during, and after Prohibition. That it was common. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, but that's in the 20th century. I mean, people probably made it in the 19th century too, but I'm saying, I think you're probably thinking about the 20th century, aren't you? With your question? But they would have made it, yes, like any ordinary people. If they couldn't afford beer down at the saloon, and you got your beer in a pail. In fact, you might send your little child down with a pail and they get the beer and bring it back, and maybe you let them have a little drink of it.
Bushmouth, Johnson.
Yeah.
influx of people that come up, they have other pastimes.
Well, no, I mean, look, drinking in Chicago caused riots because the white Protestants were angry with the Germans and the Irish for drinking on Sundays and for, one more question, and frequenting saloons. And in fact, families could go through certain doors, certain sections. Beer gardens were common in the German neighborhood. But to Protestants, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, this was a no-no. So I'm pretty sure people did make home brew, but then again, if you had enough money you were working, you'd buy it, and consume it in the amounts you so desire. Yeah, but I thought you were talking about the other type, vice. There were blacks involved in vice. I always include something about what I call the underworld, because people made money, doing what I call bad things. And that's even in the Bible. And the bad area was immediately south of here, say like from Harrison back to Roosevelt Road, then back to Cermak, along State, State, Dearborn, Clark, LaSalle. That was a bad area going into the 20th century. And there were blacks living there with whites. Gambling, you name it, all the bad things. I think he said one more question. Can we get one? Lady in the back.
You talk about Chicago in this turn of the century that you had blacks and whites living kind of side by side. There wasn't residential segregation. Were the blacks all in the service industry, or was it actually like kind of equal job opportunity, et cetera? And I ask because I'm from Cleveland, and my grandparents and their parents grew up in diverse communities, unlike what I see a lot in Chicago. And I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and, up till, say, the Great Migration, when you had a lot of extra blacks. You had very few blacks, always 2% or less of the population, almost invisible folk. That's one of the reasons people didn't want to write the history of blacks in Chicago. There were always so few. But over West, there are studies that were done. Yeah, the whites and blacks that lived near each other were all, at the bottom of the economic rung. And you find among those that don't have a lot, you have, quote unquote, a democracy, a democratic view of life. But on the north side, blacks lived around whites, and on the west side. But as this black belt grew, it's just blacks heading west to Wentworth, where the white immigrants were, and then say Wabash heading east, you had middle class and upper class whites who, based on class standards, would not want to be around very poor blacks. But the black area kept expanding and whites kept fleeing. But the demographically established segregation pattern starts around the 1920s. And of course, there's great resistance to blacks as they expand residentially. The banker, Jesse Binger, had his home bombed 9 times out at 59th and King Drive. Police were never able to find anybody, no arsonists. Dynamiting was quite, when I grew up, 40s, 50s, riots, thousands of whites would assault blacks moving into new areas. Nowadays, though, everybody lives in harmony, and that's good. Well, sorta, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can't believe the fact that there's been some progress made. The fact that this library is named after a man who became what? The city's first black man. I mean, it's incredible. I never believed that could happen. Yeah.
First black mayor of a major city was Cleveland, though. John Stokes, Carly Stokes.
Yeah, 60-something Stokes. Yeah. Are you from Cleveland?
I am, fifth generation.
Well, wait a minute now. Do you know my relatives? We'll have to talk. Where did you go to high school? Where? Okay. I think I had some at Kennedy and way back when in the bad neighborhood. They went to East Tech. You know? Okay. But we'll have to talk. I have in those Ohio relatives, yeah. Well, look, thanks for coming out. I'm going to go back for book signing. Okay.